On this week's episode of Poll Hub, President Joe Biden enjoys a post-State of the Union bounce. Just how big and where do Americans stand on his handling of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? We have the just-released NPR PBS NewsHour Marist Poll results. Then, the humanitarian side of the Ukraine crisis. We're joined by cultural anthropologist and professor at University of Michigan, Dr. Greta Uehling, to discuss the plight of the masses fleeing the country. This is Poll Hub. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Mary Griffith, sitting in for Jada Dapper this week.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
Well, it's been quite an eventful and news-filled week with world attention focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not only has the U.S. and its allies responded with sanctions against Russia, but there have been numerous efforts to mobilize countries and people to deal with the enormous humanitarian and refugee issue that has been created as Ukrainians rush to get the most vulnerable out of the war zone. And of course, if there is an important event which affects us all, there is polling. So along with our partners, NPR and PBS NewsHour, we were again in the field this week, but this time right after President Biden's State of the Union address. And I thought some interesting and surprising results. Mary, would you like to fill us all in?
Absolutely. Well, President Biden has gotten a big boost in terms of his job approval ratings overall, as well as his handling of various issues, including the crisis in Ukraine. A majority, 52% of Americans now approve of his handling of the crisis, and that's up from 34% just a week ago. And interestingly, there is widespread support for those economic sanctions that have been imposed against Russia. 83% of Americans approve of those sanctions, and there is rare bipartisan consensus on this question. And Americans are willing to make sacrifices in support of Ukraine. 69% of Americans, including 58% of Republicans, support sanctions, even if domestic energy prices go up. So we've got consensus on that issue. Looking at President Biden's overall job approval rating, it's up to 47%. That's an 8-point increase from 39% last week. Lots of other numbers that we could talk about and we will talk about. But Lee, why don't you jump in here and give us an assessment of Biden today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's important to clarify between the different polls that are being conducted. Some are reactions to his speech, the kind of like the quick ones you saw that night and night before, right after the next day. And those are of those people who watch the speech. And they tend to be more partisan to whoever the president is. So in this case, it's more of a Democratic sample. In fact, the Democrats in one of those overnight immediate polls were more than 2-to-1 the size of Republicans.
That was the CBS YouGov poll that was done, and again, it was viewers of the State of the Union, and as you pointed out, partisans tend to watch their president.
So, and then that's one thing. Our poll that you guys are talking about really has to do with the nation as a whole. It's used to be compared with what we did last week, which Mary was pointing out, and that's where we get the bounce. Now, the question is, what does this mean in terms of the numbers going forward? And presidents, typically don't get large bounces from the State Union. Since 1978, way back when, the only 6 times has a president enjoyed a bounce of 4 points or more, and 3 of those 6 times were Bill Clinton, the communicator, in chief. So what typically is the case is that you may get a point or 2, and that's been the average. Sometimes you even go down a point or 2. If you go up a little bit, it tends not to stick. So I think the first test for Joe Biden was to make his appeal, first to secure the Democratic base, which had been drifting apart from him, drifting away, and then to appeal to some independents who also had fallen in his recent numbers, and he was successful in both of those regards. The Democrats, the group that was most likely to return to him, the ones who had left him, did come back. They came back home, and that's where a lot of the bounces. It's not, the speech is not directed at Republicans. The chances of getting them to cross over is very remote. About 1 in 10 are positive towards Biden at this point. But I thought it was a very interesting speech. I thought it was a very on sometimes conciliatory, where he talked his unity agenda. Sometimes he was, being bipartisan with the infrastructure, and sometimes he was being very confrontational when he talked about the Trump tax cuts and some of the things that are going on in the red states regarding voting rights. So he covered a lot of different bases. Some of those points I was making were put together by Ron Brownstein, a friend of Marist in the show, and I thought he nailed it with that. It was a multifaceted presentation.
Well, looking at the poll that we've just completed, one of the things that I found interesting, particularly with regard to his approval rating, is this is the highest that he has been since pre-Afghanistan. Now he's still underwater, 47 approved, 50 disapprove, as you pointed out, Mary. But has he gotten a second chance to make a first impression?
I think the White House very much needed to change the messaging, or at least change the strategy in terms of their messaging. And Biden really punched through. The numbers are proof of that. In terms of where he goes from here, that is the big question. As Lee pointed out, there is some sort of boost following the State of the Union, but not typically this type of boost. And I did want to zero in on a couple of other numbers on the domestic front. Biden's handling of the economy, it's still upside down, 45% approved to 53% disapprove. But in our previous NPR PBS NewsHour survey, his approval rating was at 36% on the economy. And more good news for Biden is that his approval rating on the handling of the coronavirus pandemic, that has rebounded. He's now at a 55% approval rating, whereas last week Americans divided, and it was actually upside down, 47% approved and 49% disapproved. So on all fronts, both foreign and domestic, he really has made inroads. And Lee, what do you think really accounts for that on the domestic end of things?
Well, I mean, I think it's, it was the focus that he took, and, he tried to talk about the jobs picture. He tried to talk about the decreasing deficit. And I think, he was he was dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. And I think he did it fairly convincingly. The question, as you say, is whether it will last. There was one other number I thought that was really, really, really interesting. If you've noticed, some of the Republicans have been siding with the Democrats and siding with the president in terms of his handling of Ukraine. And there's been a unity there that we haven't really seen on a lot of issues in recent past. And one of the numbers talked about the question of whether people think Biden is too cautious, too aggressive, or about right. And over 7 in 10 Republicans said that he's being too cautious in his response to Ukraine. And what's interesting is that the Republicans have become very hawkish in their attitudes. And if you notice, even Donald Trump, who called Putin brilliant about 2 weeks ago or a week ago, and with his strategy, now is calling it misnamed, but he's calling it a Holocaust now. So the Republicans have moved on this in ways we haven't seen in some time.
Well, I just wanted to point out that I think the word you were looking for, Lee, when about Trump, was that he had called the invasion genius when President Putin first invaded. But yes, there's a lot more to the poll. Certainly can go to our website to drill down into some of these numbers. But I think this is something that is also going to be with us for a while, along with Americans rallying behind the people of Ukraine, as you pointed out, Mary, to even 7 in 10 agreeing that even if it costs us higher energy prices, the sanctions are very important. But there's real concern. There's real concern about the President Putin perhaps inflicting cyber attacks on the US, going beyond the borders of Ukraine to other parts of Europe. He has taken down satellite access to a company in London, and of course, especially for those who lived during the Cold War, the threat of nuclear attacks and the use of nuclear weapons is something that people feel are very real. So to be continued, and certainly something we will continue to monitor.
Well, we've been focusing on the political ramifications of the conflict in Ukraine, specifically for President Joe Biden, but we'd like to turn now to the humanitarian crisis that has developed as a result of Russia's invasion. The UN estimates that nearly 900,000 refugees have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries, with more expected. That's as of this recording on Wednesday afternoon. Here to discuss this dimension of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is Dr. Greta Uehling. Dr. Uehling is a cultural anthropologist with a focus in forced migration, professor and lecturer in the programs in international and comparative studies at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Uehling is also a faculty associate with the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Uehling.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, just right off the bat, what is your assessment of the refugee situation?
You know, this refugee situation is very serious. You mentioned the figure of approximately 900,000 having left their country just in the last few days, leaving Ukraine for other European countries. But the UN Refugee Agency is expecting around 4 million refugees in the next week, right? And so this is a very intense flow. The International Committee for the Red Cross estimates that approximately 7 million are displaced internally. And this is, of course, where there's the greatest need. So we're really looking at a humanitarian population of somewhere around 11 million people displaced from their homes. And that doesn't include, military casualties or other people that are going to need assistance. Just for comparison, the Syrian refugee crisis, led to about 6.8 million Syrians as refugees and another 6.7 displaced within their country. So that humanitarian population is approximately under 14, but that we're now in the 11th year of that. So I think that gives you some perspective that this is a very intense humanitarian crisis.
I wanted to get a sense of this because it's, from our perspective, this has become sudden news, whereas it's something that Ukrainian people have been dealing with. When are people leaving from a particular geographic area? Are they going to a particular geographic area? When you say it's going to grow to 4 million, do I assume that that's where, the bombings are occurring, is going to be creating the refugees? And I assume there's a lot of women and children, but the men are doing more of the fighting. I just want to get a sense of the people's dimension in this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question, Lee. Really great question. I actually do look at this crisis as a continuation and an escalation of a crisis that began in 2014 when Russian Federation took control of the Crimean Peninsula, and then, of course, the war over the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces began. And so the people that are being displaced from their homes are primarily women and children, because the men have been asked to stay and fight to defend their country. So it is primarily the women, the children, and the elderly that are leaving. And it's important to appreciate that many of these individuals have been displaced already once, or perhaps 2 or 3 times in the last 8 years due to those initial conflicts in Crimea and the eastern regions.
You do mention that it is actually almost 8 years to the day of the invasion and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. After that, though, you actually spent some time in Ukraine as a Fulbright scholar. And I know that you did some research there as well, and find a lot of comparisons to that time. What can we learn from what you saw at that time to dealing with the situation that we have today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, my findings between 2015 and 2017, when I was based in Ukraine during the summers, are consistent with today. I interviewed about 150 people who had either been displaced themselves or were humanitarians trying to help the displaced. And I think that what I found was, a place with military conflict in residential areas, armed saboteurs, was paradoxically also a place where people had very strong moral compass and ethics were thriving, right? So what I studied was basically the practices that people developed for reestablishing a livable world. And I use this term everyday war to describe how civilians ended up, trying to maintain peace amongst themselves to the extent that that was possible, but also participating in the conflict.
We see all these images on the news of Ukrainians crossing the border to nearby countries like Poland, but they don't know what their next steps are. So can you share a little bit in terms of what they can expect or what the situation for them is once they forge this new path to safety and to security?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, what a great question. So we could talk about rights, and we could talk about the challenges that they face. In the realm of rights, the European Union is preparing to grant them a blanket right to stay and work throughout the 27 European nations for up to 3 years. So they would, with that right to stay, they would receive social welfare benefits, access to housing, medical treatment, schooling for their children. This is, of course, historic. The European Union devised this kind of protective policy in the 1990s, after the war in the Balkans, but they never used it until now. And so they're suspending the usual rules of applying for asylum within the European Union, of that you must apply in the first country of safety, right? They're allowing Ukrainians for the time being to move around the US.
Are you surprised by this outpouring of public support? I mean, this is really just a global movement. And does that take you by surprise?
I think that it really makes sense in terms of the geopolitical context and the European context. So
tell our listeners a little bit what you mean about that.
Okay, so with the European context, I think it's a mark of disapproval with Russian Federation, disapproval and frustration with the regime of Vladimir Putin. Second, it's consistent with the principle of seeking haven in the first country. These people are, going to neighboring countries, and that's certainly consistent with European practice. And then finally, I think that the response might be quite different in Europe because there's really a longstanding tradition of Ukrainian nationals coming to the European Union to work and to study. And so many of the people who are flowing across the borders may end up working with or sheltering with extended family, friends, or fellow Ukrainians.
I was just going to say that the having refugees around the world is nothing new. Certainly not to Ukraine, and certainly not to many other countries. We've had these situations because of everything from natural disasters to internal conflicts, and of course war. I just from your studies, how can the world better prepare to deal with people who end up being displaced through these horrific circumstances? Certainly, the EU has taken a historic step here. Is that a lesson that others can take as well?
I think so. I think there's a great deal to be said for capacity building all over the world to prevent such conflicts from arising. I think that there's a crucial question about the sustainability of many of these efforts, right? We're in the very beginning stages. We don't know how long this crisis will last, but in other crises, it's certainly the case that compassion fatigue can set in. And so I think it would be, mindful to always be careful about the sustainability of the efforts.
I've sort of two quick questions. One is sometimes in the United States, we get very involved with things and then we sort of move on. And I don't know if that's a concern that this is going to, sustain the interests of the United States. And the second question, which is somewhat related, is your current research. You have another book coming out, and I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, I think that the attention of the media can be fickle because it is their job to go to not necessarily the largest crisis or the most significant crisis, but the freshest crisis. But off to the side, humanitarians are working, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And their attention to these crises, as long as funding can be found, does not wane, does not ebb and flow. And there have been, significant disbursements of funds on the part of the United Nations, on the part of the EU, on the part of the United States, that will help them do that important work. The two crucial variables being access and coordination, right? So the people who have been able to leave Ukraine are in relatively good, safe conditions. The people that I'm most concerned about are the people who are attempting to shelter in place. And that's very difficult because it's difficult to gain access to them. It's difficult to coordinate the flows of aid in the midst of an ongoing military conflict. And so to my way of thinking, at least right now, those are the most vulnerable people.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the situation?
It's hard to say. I think that we have underestimated Vladimir Putin. If he mentions using nuclear weapons, he's not bluffing. He's not kidding. So I'm not terribly optimistic. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but by the same token, Ukrainians are fighting hard. And if you had the privilege of witnessing the resilience the way I saw it, it restored my faith in humanity to be among them, right? Those ethics of care extended to the living, to the dead, to the enemy, to the friend. Yeah, it was amazing. The Ukrainian military at one point was too weak to go collect the remains of fallen soldiers. Volunteers did it. They put on masks. They rented trucks. And they went and they did that. Yeah. And so examples like that abound, right? And so in terms of like, the Ukrainian people can't be dominated. They can't be eradicated. They can't be eliminated, but they are in for the fight of their life.
Dr. Greta Uehling from the University of Michigan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Poll Hub listeners. This is Ashley Marcinek, the Poll Hub producer, hopping in real quick. In lieu of a fun fact this week, we really wanted to take the time to let you know some of the ways that you can help Ukraine, either through donations or other resources. The show notes for this episode will include links to various sources, such as care.org, Doctors Without Borders, and GoFundMe's to help keep the media keep going. In a time like this, it is important that we can help each other in any way we can.
That'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ashley Marcinek, Athen Hollis, and Emily Fry.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as we release it.
We'll see you next time.